of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call and signify their presence in this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call or other electronic medium. Joyce Baptiste.
Here.
Rebecca Culver-Turner.
Here.
John Fleeker.
I'm here.
And James Godby.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
And Ashley Van Buskirk.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning the meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at the meeting today as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we're conducting the public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to the meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting the meeting pursuant to KOMA. On August 17th, 2021, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website at ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials will be posted to the board's website on the day of the meeting. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240, or currently right now, we would request individuals send an email alternatively to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda.
Thank you, David. We can now go on to the other content of our meeting. The first item on our order of business is approval of the minutes from the June meeting. Those were sent in your packet, so as soon as anyone has a chance to review, I'll accept a motion for those.
I reviewed them already, and I submit proposal of approving them.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Joyce. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great, thank you. We will move on to our next item, which is the Executive Director's Report.
Thank you, Mary. So since the last time the advisory committee met, there have been a few items I wanted to make the advisory committee members aware of. First, there is a new chair of the board. The new chair of the board is Leslie Seawester, and the new vice chair of the board is Dave Anderson. So I wanted to congratulate both of those two individuals, and we're looking forward, or actually we are working with them now in their new positions. I wanted to let you know that a former executive director of the BSRB, Mary Ann Gable, she has served with the board from about 1980 to about 2000. She passed away on September 1st, 2021, so we went ahead and sent flowers to the visitation on behalf of the agency and the board. In terms of a few other updates, every state agency is asked to submit a budget request each year on September 15th. And so that is one item that I have been working on for the last few months. And that item was submitted to the Division of Budget. It is currently in the process of being reviewed by the Division of Budget and ultimately the governor's office. And recommendations for our budget will come out generally about the first week in January. But there was already an approved budget for fiscal year 22 and also fiscal year 23. So this really has to do with adjustments to those two budget years and also reviewing performance measures for the agency. And so that information was submitted. Overall, the summary is that the amounts that we were approved for, we went ahead and met those amounts for 22 and 23. We did have some internal fluctuations based on some cost. We anticipate less travel expenses due to the COVID pandemic. We anticipate some other contractual services expenditures due to different services that the agency obtains, but overall, it shouldn't be too different from the budget that was submitted last year. We were also asked to submit a strategic 3-year IT plan. And so we did review that and submit a new plan for the next 3 years. A few of the items we've talked about a little bit in the past. Over the next year, we hope to go ahead and move some of the initial licensure application to an online process. We will probably still provide a paper version of doing that, but the renewals have primarily moved to the online system, and we've been receiving a lot of favorable comments about that. I think right now about 80 to 90% of renewals are done through the online system. And so we hope to move the initial applications to that as well. We have a number of paper records here in the office, and we're looking at trying to find a way to convert a lot of those records to electronic records instead of paper. So that's something else that's going to be on the table for the next 3 years, moving in that direction. And there's a couple other items too, in terms of changing over some old technology that's getting a little bit older, replacing it with some newer technology and different things like that. So just want to make you aware that those are some things on the long-term goals for the agency. And also in the realm of technology, I wanted to let you know we did have a few issues recently with the website for the BSRB. There's a company called Sitefinity, which oversees most of the state agency websites. And there was a rollover that took place about 2 weeks ago. We were told that we would expect no loss of data on the website, and unfortunately that was not true. We had some significant problems, as did a lot of other state agencies. We lost about 2.5 months of information on the website. So our staff members, Ashley Van Buskirk primarily, was working on re-uploading a lot of that content to the website. But I know that it involved other staff members too, in terms of preparing links and doing a lot of other work and to get things back up. And they did a great job. However, a lot of other agencies were continuing to have problems. So they did a rollback just about a week ago to what it looked like when they did the conversion back on about September 20th or so. So if you've noticed any recent problems with the website, we are hoping that those are now resolved. But if you notice anything, please go ahead and reach out to me, let me know. And unfortunately, it did cause an impact on different things. We worked as quickly as possible, put out a notice on the website about the issues that we were aware of. But that is one thing that we've been kind of dealing with everything else. So. I wanted to let you know also, since the last time your advisory committee had met, when you last met, we were back to working full-time in the office with most of the BSRB employees. In August, the governor's office directed us to return to primarily doing remote work for most of the employees in the office. We were also asked to continue operations in person here at the office that same time too. So we've been trying to find the balance to make sure that we're being mindful of the health of the employees, but also making sure that the staff can work productively in their different environments. We did purchase some additional technology in terms of monitors and cords to help employees have a better work setup at home for the remote work continuing. We were notified that was originally going to be through October 4th, and that has been extended through the end of October now. So we're just going to have to wait to see if that goes forward after the end of October, or if we're asked to move employees back into the office. But I can tell you our staff has done an amazing job of juggling, going back and forth. We're having all staff at least in the office 1 day a week so that they can make sure to do any kind of in-person work that's necessary. But we're trying to do as much as possible for certain individuals at home and juggle the logistics with that. We had a staff member resign just a little bit ago. And so we have been in the process of advertising for a senior administrative assistant position. That advertisement did close, and we actually have some interviews set up next week. So we're going to be interviewing candidates, and we hope to identify a candidate to bring in. We're going to start those interviews, I believe, on Tuesday of next week, and Tuesday and Wednesday. And so if we're able to move forward, we can bring somebody in. Otherwise, we might have to reopen that, but we're optimistic that we can find a good candidate of the applicants. And then just kind of wanted to let you know just some general board updates. The board has a yearly annual planning meeting, sometimes referred to as the board retreat. This year, because of the COVID-19 variant and other concerns, we weren't able to hold that meeting in person. However, the board decided to go ahead and split that meeting into 2 half-day meetings done virtually over Zoom. So the first of those meetings took place on September 27th, and the board reviewed a number of topics that they had identified for further discussion. The second day of that planning session is going to be on October 25th, and that'll be in the afternoon of that date. And those meetings are broadcast just as the regular board meetings and advisory committee meetings on the board's YouTube channel. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my report and stand for any questions.
Thank you, David. Does anyone have any questions about his report? It's nice to get all the updates, so we appreciate you providing that to us. Well, I am going to dive right in because we do have a lot of agenda items today that hopefully we can touch on. And 2 of them are old, so I wanted to start there. As David talked about the planning retreat, the item of the record of deceased practitioners came up again, and I'm hoping they can help me fill in some of the information here. But one of the items that we were requested to do is bring it back to the advisory committee. I believe, if I remember correctly, there's only one other state is that what we ended up talking about? There was only one other state that actually had this in their regulation or statute, okay, that it was required. So it seemed to be of the board, there was consensus that it's a good thing to do, but the question becomes, do we want to make sure that it is a statutory or, outside of just kind of guiding practice? So we were asked to bring it back to the advisory groups to really find out what the advisory groups think about whether or not we should put this forward. Again, just a reminder, if we do statutory changes, they have to go through the legislative process. So that's something then, if this is something we want to move forward, we would have to initiate a bill that would go forward next session. So just opening up for conversation.
So the question is, this is Joyce, whether we want this to be a stipulation or a recommendation. Is that correct?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, I think we all inherently agreed that it was good practice to have these professional wills, if you will. But do we want it to be regulated and put into language in statutory regulation, statute and regulation? And then it would become something that the BSRB would need to monitor and track and make sure that there was some compliance with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I have a question for the BSRB. Have you come across a situation where you've had to dig for the records of clients of therapists who've been deceased and not been able to get a hold of it? Has it been an issue?
I don't know if it's that they couldn't get a hold of them. It's that no one really knows what they're doing when they, one person just abandoned the records.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 parts of it. One is if someone passes away unexpectedly and who would take custodianship of their records, and then the other one is, like Leslie said, abandoned records. And it sounds like this comes up probably a couple times per year, I think. And right now in Kansas, the current method really is just there's a division of the Attorney General's office that can temporarily, come in and take records. If they find an office and there's records that have been abandoned, they can temporarily take them, but they're really not a custodian in terms of some entity that would take requests for those records and respond to patients wanting to get their records. So, so it doesn't come up all the time, but it is something that comes up, I would say about once or twice a year, at least from what I have heard.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca, were you going to add?
Just thinking through this. So you said you really only found one other state that has addressed this in their regulations.
Yes.
Yeah, where it's by statute, that they have to have a plan for their records.
Yeah, I think it was Oregon is the state that has that.
This might be able to go in unprofessional conduct. I know that was kind of added around, but I don't.
Yeah, I think there's, if you were to splice out the issues here, the first one is, do we support a statutory change that requires this? And then the second, if then it would be, what is the implementation? And this committee had great ideas previously when we talked about it, about how that might be. And they were very consistent with the other advisory committees, like add something to a renewal application, add something to, that we could kind of figure those pieces out. But I think the first question is, is it good practice to do, or is it a law,
Well, and I think
or
it's
both.
mainly private practice, solo practice, because if you work for an agency, the agency takes over the records. If you work in a group practice, usually there's some kind of thing like that. So I think it's good practice. I don't know if we want to go through the whole people, make it a law kind of thing.
So if we started this and it was a statute, how long would it take to put it into effect?
Well, David can correct me on this, but let's assume we put it in for this session that starts early next year, and it were to be approved. There's a couple of different methods in which it can become law. And it depends if we have a date of an act that becomes law, or if they can do it in the register. You better speak now, David, because I'm going to lose this. But if it's in the, they can do it like they did the supervision hours and all of that, where it became kind of this July timeframe. But go ahead, David.
Sure. So if it is in a bill, it's possible that it could go into effect as soon as the bill is enacted, which would be most bills go into effect upon publication in the statute book, which tends to be about July 1st. There's also a method of having an earlier date of effectiveness, which is upon publication in the Kansas Register, which is I think it's a weekly publication by the Secretary of State's office. But one of the items on that too is that it depends if the statutory change would be sufficient to go ahead and make the change, or if it would need some accompanying regulatory language too. If it does need to be fleshed out in regulations, then probably the statute changing, we would have to have the statute and then have regulatory language to accompany that. And then once that regulatory language was put into effect, that's kind of when it would be expected that practitioners would have that responsibility. And in terms of the statutory process, if what we did for the bill that passed this last year, that the BSRB requested 2208, that bill, we went ahead and sent a letter to licensees, making them aware of the different contents of the bill. So if another bill was passed that was requested by the board, we would likely do the same thing and send out a letter to licensees to inform them. The regulatory process does have a time for public comment. So if there's regulatory language, part of that process is to open it up and have it posted and then allow people to provide comment back and then have some legislative oversight. So it really depends if you can do it just in a bill or if you can do it with the bill and the regulatory language.
So what the other question is, what do the other members of the board that representing, like social work and all the other counselors do towards this topic?
Well, I think it's sort of what we're talking about now, that it's a hit and miss. Most of the advisory committees endorse that this is good practice. I'm not sure I got a sense that everyone felt like this should be that we should move forward, particularly when we kind of discovered that there was only one other state that requires it. There was concern brought up that, the BSRB's ability to track and manage this data when it changes, maybe within a cycle of someone's licensure, if we do it then, what if that the person they've dedicated as custodian, something happens with that person? So there's all these other things that I think were of concern in terms of the administration of something like this. But I think there was consensus, good practice, but I think that's why they said, send it back to your advisory committees and see if we want to put this forward.
So basically, if we did this, we may be the only group that does this.
Well, we could do a couple of things, and that would be my next question. If our group says, you know, we really feel this should become statutory language, then I also say, you know, I always kind of bring back to this group, our hope in many ways is that our disciplines kind of align on things. Mm-hmm. And so if everyone else said no, would we still want to put it forward as the MFTs? And that can be done. You know, I mean, there are social work statutes that are different than MFT statutes. So those are kind of then the nuances of what I would want to know from this group, taking it into the board, to the larger board.
Well, I agree that it's good practice. And I think that, you know, if you're going to say that, you just, well, do what you can to, you know, live that out. Statute might be the way to do it.
Okay.
I think I'm wrestling right now with differentiating between like best practices and does this need to be regulated at the state level? I kind of wish I had this like pretty flow chart in front of me that helped me decide. I think right now, and not to say that I couldn't be influenced, I feel like it's a little bit more in the arena of this is a best practice, not maybe something that should be regulated at the state level. But I really am kind of wrestling with that, how to differentiate between those two.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I that's exactly where I am, Rebecca, is that the more I've thought about this, I think if there's a way that we can incorporate it into good practice without making it statute, I'm probably in favor of that. But I could be swayed either way. So I feel very much the same as you. I think my concerns go to you know, implementation timeframe, administration of the BSRB's time and in handling that, and those kind of probably more logistic things than I need to be thinking about. But
that's what I'm leaning towards, to more best practice, because I'm looking at the frequency of this issue. It's twice a year. So 2 therapists, I'm thinking 2 therapists out of however many we have, the percentage of the number of therapists that this happens to, is that, you know, it's cost benefit analyses in terms of the amount of time and effort we put into this. What's the payoff in that sense? So best practice, and then something in our, as we mentioned, when therapists renew their license, to have a question that they would, to a reminder that this is something they have to do and have they done it. Perhaps even asking I don't know whether this would mean additional work for BSRB to monitor. Can they name who that person is, who's the custodian of their records? So I don't know whether that's something that we could do rather than put it in the statutes.
And I think that's a valid question, Joyce, and one that came up as well, which is if we're not really doing anything with it, should we put that on the BSRB staff to even check a box or put a name? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, if we are going to administrate this issue, then yes, we need to do all those things. But if we're not, then why would we ask, and really who's responsible for that, other than the fact that it gives the practitioner the reminder of, yes, I need to be thinking about this. So that's where it got a little strange too in some of our discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not to throw another wrinkle in there, but if you're looking at, most places have gone electronic health record, and you know, it's a website or it's a computer kind of program that, or keeper or service, you know. So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to keep these paper files, but how do we notify them about like, oh, it's TheraScribe or this over here, and this is where your data is, and how long do we keep it, and all that good stuff. So I'm leaning to the best practice because I can see how complicated this quickly would go into it, and I'm just, again, like Joyce was saying, the cost analysis of it doesn't really seem to be worth it to me, but I'm still up in the air about it.
Okay. I'm going to say that our consensus at this point is really the best practice. And then if there are really strong advisory committees who say, let's move this into law, I would bring it back to you guys to see if we wanted to be included in that. Does that sound fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so another item for discussion that we talked about last time was the CEU requirements, the proposal that there be a 3-hour CEU requirement for diversity, equity, inclusion. So in our conversations in this advisory committee, I think we all sort of were thinking about it, okay, if there could be some things associated with that. The board had several committees for putting it into, again, this would be a statutory requirement, just like your diagnostic and treatment, that's 6 hours, and your 3-hour ethics, this would be then requiring 3 hours in diversity, equity, inclusion. I personally wasn't in favor of putting it into a requirement, and my reasoning for that was because of the, we're prescribing so many hours of the CEU. However, there was a lot of discussion in our advisory committee and in the board is, could those CEUs be counted for other things? So if I took something that was DEI related, but it had ethics, could I combine those, and could one 3-hour be my other 3-hour? Currently, our regulations do not support that. So we would have to, if that's what we wanted, we would also have to do some regulatory language changes. So for example, if I would say diagnosis and treatment of, African-American women, then I couldn't count that at that as diagnosis and treatment and the cultural without regulatory changes. So just kind of making that clear.
Mary, sorry, I just wanted to clarify one point. And Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the non-overlapping or non-double counting, I think that's been just a BSRB policy. I'm not sure if that practice is.
Oh, okay, thank you. I misunderstood that.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, but I think that's how that's been interpreted.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that correction.
Yeah, so currently that's just been the way that we've done things. We haven't allowed things to double count or count for more than one category. So that would be a change in our practice, but it's not in the regulations specifically spelled out. So yeah.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you clarifying that. So I think the question that is before us, the first question is, are we in support of saying this is a 3-hour requirement on every CEU cycle? That's really the first question. And then we can get into what we were just talking about is, could things count in multiple categories? In our previous conversation, just to keep everyone sort of refreshed, because it's been since June, we talked about having a very broad perspective of what would work for diversity, equity, inclusion. In our group specifically, I know gave an example of rural. If you're in rural Kansas working with farmers, could that, and you took a CEU specific to that group, would that be counted versus maybe something that was around race or gender identity or anything like that. So it seemed like there was consensus in the board that would be broad. There was a lot of in favor of that, but just ready to get your take on it. I know, again, there was at least one other group that didn't want to do it. Social work seemed a little more ambivalent and taking it back to their committee too. So just wanting to get the sense from this group.
I'm in favor of adding the CEUs for diversity, inclusion, and equity and inclusion, and in favor of the overlap.
Okay.
Mary, did you say that the other professions were kind of across the board, like some were for it, some were ambivalent, and some were thinking no?
Yeah, there was a mix, sort of like ours, which is it's sort of, we could be in favor if this, but I'm not really in favor of more CE requirements, just because I think we're creeping up to half of the CE requirements that are specified. But again, I will endorse what this committee wants. For sure, the one of the groups was for it. The psychologist group, definitely for it. And I may have that wrong. It's the psychologist and then the master's level psychologist. The Dave Anderson's group is, they were kind of saying, like I was, like not really in favor, and unless it could be super broad. I think they could be swayed that way too. One group adamantly for social work was going to kind of think about it with their committee again too. But we were all asked to bring it back to our committee.
And how did this first come up? Sorry, I'm trying to like refresh back to June.
I believe that, and David could fill me in, when it first came up, it was brought by the psychologists.
Well, so yeah, there are kind of two things that happened simultaneously.
Okay.
There was a general message that came in for the Social Work Advisory Committee. And then there was a formal request. Some individuals requested public comment for the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee, and they were representatives from KPA. And so the representatives from KPA talked to the advisory committee and requested a change in the statutes and regulations. The social work request was more of a broad request on this topic. And then the social work had a discussion about it after that. So it was kind of those two groups that started the conversation, and then more advisory committees were asked to have those discussions too, and then bring back any recommendations or comments for the board.
Okay. Thank you.
I would be in favor of it as long as the parameters were fairly broad and the potential for overlap could occur, but definitely the parameters and the definition would have to be pretty broad.
And that was one thing I was fairly vocal about in the board meeting, I guess is the best way to say it, is that I think where the tenor of the world is right now is in, certain pockets of diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think as practitioners, depending on your specific practice, that's where your competency needs to lie. Not that those other issues aren't important, they're crucially important, but you want to make sure that you're getting training that is really in line with your practice parameters. And that's where I thought definition would get really difficult. And, as an example, if I do specific training with severe and persistently mentally ill, that is a training around cultural competence around that particular group, because there's certain things that happen among that group that may not happen in other populations. And is that included in a definition? And that's where I think for me that part got really dicey, of how do you define what meets that requirement? But I agree in the sense of we should all be getting training in competent practice for the people we're serving.
I mean, Mary, you asked a really good question, because and I think one thing we have to think about is we are all working with individuals who have some form of disability, mental health disability. So that is already a population. So I think what we're talking about is the intersectionality of having a mental health disability and something else. Can we be trained in not just looking at mental health disability, but with physical disability? That would be, I would say that would fall into that, the category that we're talking about, diversity, equity, inclusion. It could be race and ethnicity, it could be nationality, it could be, immigrant status, it could be rural, urban, geographical location, it could be sexual orientation, it could be income level, socioeconomic status. So, but the mental health is mental health. We all are already trained in that.
Mm-hmm. And that was just sort of again, I went to this sort of functional concern of what qualifies, and how many calls Leslie will get was saying, will this training meet the requirement for kind of thing. But
we probably have to come up with a statement to qualify that, to help the board.
Jim, do you have thoughts?
I think that the whole thing about being broad is the thing that I was concerned with, because I think that, like you said, when you're looking at a certain group of people, I just see that it's needed, but I think it's, again, just to keep it broad to be able to be useful for the person where they're practicing. And I think that's my main concern with it.
Okay. John?
Well, I was sitting there thinking about, could this be an ethics thing, or could this be a diagnostic thing? Obviously, people at different workplaces should, focus on our own, but we also want to be able to be receptive to all diverse areas. But I'm a little hesitant, like you, Mary, that would be, 12 hours of prescribed things, and that kind of limits what other trainings they might want to have or whatever. And I think if you go too broad, then it might not be as diverse as we want to be as well. So trying to define that all the time could become a full-time job just on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to kind of make both of those things happen. I think it's important to be able to work with different populations of genetic, everything that we deal with, and how to be inclusive in that. But we're also I don't know. So I think it's a good training idea. I just don't know how we would include, make that a statute. I think if all the branches were doing kind of like, we're all going to make a stand and we're all going to try to do that, then I'd be a little bit more certain. But
I think that's what the board would like.
Yeah.
The board kind of wanted it across the board.
We try it whenever we can to get that. And what I heard mostly from our group is yes, if
yeah,
yes, if we could ensure that the definition was broad. Yes, if we could ensure that there's crossover, that if I take an ethics for X population, that it would count under both categories. But you'd still end up having to have a total of 40 hours, but one could count in two buckets.
Mm-hmm.
So when the board meets again, that's my recommendation from our advisory is yes, if. Does that sound that I captured that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Good job.
Okay.
Does it sounds like, Mary, that we then would every profession have to agree on the definition then? Or the parameters?
I think that would be the next work would be, and I did hear that already, Rebecca, that I think people, generally speaking, the committees thought you want it to be meaningful for your practice. And, you know, if we prescribe that too closely, then we don't get that. So yes, there'd have to be a definition, but I think the board would work with the BSRB staff would be my guess.
So I have a question. What's the difference between yes, if, and yes, and? Yes, we want this, and we like it like this. They're all, yeah.
Well, I think if the committees said, we want the CEU, but everyone else didn't want to be able to cross it over into accounting in different buckets, you know, which I actually think that won't happen. I think everyone was interested in being able to count it in several categories. But I would just bring that forth of, yes, this is our committee would like this, and these are the things we would like with it. And I wouldn't reject putting it into without coming back to you all and saying, hey, this has been a proposal from this group, so that when if we submit this as a legislative item, we have consensus from our group.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right, something a little dicier. We're into new business. Leslie, I'll bring this to you to help us talk about the in-residence educational requirements.
So for MFT, the in-residence educational requirement says half of the coursework has to be done in residence at the institution in face-to-face, breathing the same air contact with core faculty. And that's all defined. Core faculty is defined, everything's there. And that is for if the school is CONFETI or not, the program, they still have to do half of the hours in residence. And the board's looking at in residence in and of itself, but specifically yours, because even the professional accreditation is included in the fact that they have to have half of the hours in residence, and other professions, it's not like that. So I guess specifically for your group, it would be changing the regulation so that only non-CONFETI programs would have to do half of their hours in residence.
So this is coming up a lot with, obviously, the way education is happening now. Very different. Even before COVID, things were very different because you're seeing a lot more long distance learning programs, those kind of things. So questions or comments about whether or not we want to move forward with this?
I think it would make sense if it's a COAMP regulated or accredited program, then we would follow, that would be sufficient, whether it's in resident or not in resident. So the question is the non-COAMP accredited programs, am I correct?
Yes.
Well, yes and no. Do you want to change your regulation then to allow COMPETI programs to be done all online? Because they've met that extra.
I would say so, because that's an accredited body that oversees the curriculum. And if they've approved it, I would say that we could quite safely approve it too.
So that's
Leslie, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so that's the first half. I guess if you guys want to see if you agree.
That's just my thought.
I would be in favor of allowing any COA program, whether it was, and I don't think there's a lot of accredited MFT programs online anyways, but would be in favor of allowing any COA program. And I think I would be in favor of keeping the in-residence requirement for those that aren't accredited.
Leslie, what was the language on the non-accredited? We were trying to line that up with the addiction counseling language. Is that?
Yes, and we didn't send that out. So
I did not send that out. Yeah.
I didn't think about that really. I was looking at the approved supervisor stuff, so I didn't even.
Okay, you're ready for that one.
Yeah. So addiction counselors, they have in residence, but they have to do 2 courses in residence, and they allow the practice ones. Practice courses have to be the 2 in residence. So it could be practicum 1 and practicum 2, and it allows the person on site that's supervising them to be counted as core faculty or faculty in their case. And then like intro to addictions and so I don't know the other 2 courses, but essentially they have 4 courses, they can choose 2, and they have to be in residence, and their definition of in residence is much broader.
And that's a bachelor level or not even required bachelor's, right?
They have to have a bachelor's now.
Because I can't remember. Back when I was doing it, it was only 18 hours. And I had a clinical license in that.
That's the apps. That's the old app certification, John.
Yeah. Well, I know I'm old.
I feel you. Me too. I had that too.
I got both those clinical licenses. But.
So they have core faculty means an individual who's part of the teaching staff of a program covered by this regulation and who meets the following: has education, training, blah, 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 is identified with the program and is centrally involved in program development, decision-making, blah, blah, blah. In residence, when used to describe a student, means the student is present at the physical location of the institution or at any other location approved by the board for the purpose of completing coursework. During which the student and 1 or more core faculty members, adjunct faculty members, or agency internship supervisors are in face-to-face contact.
Leslie, I'm going to pause for just a second. David, on the advisory committees, are there any quorum issues we have to be mindful of?
Yeah.
Since we've lost Jim for a meeting and Leslie's gone and Jardine's gone, I just want to be, there's 4 of us, but.
Yep, so there are currently 7 members of the advisory committee. So majority would be 4, and you currently have 4 members, so that's not an issue. If you would fall below quorum, you wouldn't be able to make any official decisions like recommendations. Now, informational purposes, that's a different subject, but yeah, you still have quorum, so there's no issue with making recommendations.
Okay, thanks I wanted to pause since Jim was leaving and waving out. Okay, so
and their coursework, because I didn't say it right, is 2 of 4 methods of individual counseling, methods of group counseling, practicum 1 or practicum 2. And we also discussed, Mary, that sometimes there are schools where the coursework is online, but it's face-to-face. So the people are still in contact with the faculty of the university face-to-face, but it's not at the institution.
In the same kind of that physical.
Yeah.
And MFT isn't structured that way? Is that? It wouldn't allow.
MFT says you have to be at the location of the institution. So it would either be that if the person was face-to-face, they would have to be in an off-site location that is part of the university, or they wouldn't be able to count it. But the reason that I know about this is that there have been people from the military in MFT specifically who did all their coursework was face-to-face, but it was online and they were overseas.
And that's where this really comes up. I mean, because in the accredited programs, we are covered. We're really covered. Mm-hmm. But in the non-accredited programs, when we get applications for licensure, we are challenged sometimes to approve them because of these issues. And as you know, as things have shifted, we've had some requirements about making sure that there's reciprocity with military and military families and getting licensed faster, and you know, and still maintaining the requirements and safety. That's where these issues really kind of come hitting home a little bit here. And so it's like, well, balancing, you know, what is really the quality of the program that people are getting, and that definition of physical space or at the institution kind of definitions.
I imagine, and so correct me if I'm wrong, that there are probably not very many clinicians who are applying for licensure from non-accredited programs in Kansas. Would that be true?
Out of state life, yeah.
Out of state.
Okay. There are a lot of people who apply from out of state that have already been licensed, so that's taken care of. But there are, I would say, maybe 10 a year.
Okay. Yeah. I would be in favor of keeping our in-residence requirements for non-accredited programs to half the credits, which is there should be about 30 credits, am I correct? Which are 10 courses.
No, MFT coursework has never been updated. And so there's only like 36 hours required.
Oh, 36. So that'll be 18. Mm-hmm. That's only 6 courses. That's I would be in favor of just keeping it and not changing it. Because once people know that the programs, if they did want to do an online program, a distance program, then they'll choose an accredited program.
I think I'm influenced by, I was a counseling faculty at Fort Hays for 3 years. And at that time, I think they're accredited now, but you know, at that time they weren't accredited. And there's a huge difference between like the state expectations and then accreditation. And as a faculty member in a non-accredited program, I even appreciated that in-residence line for our program because it helped keep some kind of standard, because that was the only standard that we were really pushed to follow was at the state level. And so if that had been let go, I think it would have changed the quality of the program from what it was even at that time. So it helps maintain some quality.
Yeah, I also am supportive of that, maintaining that in residence.
So it sounds like we are in favor of keeping things as they are. Is that how I understand that?
Yes. Including the COA MFTE programs?
Right. So think about what Leslie's saying. If in fact the accreditation standard changed, then
you can do both. You can allow all online programs with professional accreditation, and then non-professionally accredited programs would have to do the residency.
I would go with that. Yes. Mm-hmm. So if it's an accredited by COAMP, then they would be fine. They don't have the in-residence requirements. So these are programs that are not accredited by COAMP. Then they would need 50% of their hours needs to be in residence.
And the definition of residence is we're all okay with that definition.
And it's physical. And can you tell me, could you repeat that definition again? Sorry.
Let me get to yours. In residence, when used to describe a student, means the student is present at the physical location of the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in face-to-face contact.
So there's really the two parts, the physical location and face-to-face, because we all know as we're meeting today, we all went to bat to make sure this is considered face-to-face work that we're doing. But there's that other piece of physical location.
So something like this would not count. Is that correct?
That's
correct. What that definition says. And I'll say, you know, I remember very clearly Leslie talking to me about this person who was like in Germany. It was a military person and had done her schooling, and there's no way for her to be physically at that program, but she completed all the coursework as we are meeting today. So that's where I think, you know, when I look at workforce issues and I'm balancing all that with quality, most certainly, but there are some circumstances where it feels like, oh gosh, they did all this training and education and we can't count that.
And it wasn't an accredited program, is that correct?
That's correct. But it met all the requirements.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough one. And then if you think of COVID, the last 18 months, like K-State, all our courses were online. And if we weren't an accredited program, then that individual wouldn't have been able to count those hours. So there may have to be some, caveats there. If it's like COVID, last 18 months, does that mean nothing is counted? It's only half, right? The other half they could do outside the 18 months in residence.
Right.
Is there any way to kind of spell out the language? Because there's a difference between this type of meeting where I'm seeing people's faces and it's interactive versus a Blackboard situation where we put post in it and you don't really interact with them.
Right.
You know.
What is it? Synchronous, face-to-face? Is that what it would be?
All the new words we've brought on our language this last couple of years. Yeah, and I think that's where, I hear your point, John. None of us want to license someone who's been in chat rooms for their education. That's just not, we want people with real practical knowledge, but I think about the conferences I've attended over the last couple of years that have all been virtual and we're engaging with people and those kind of things. It is different. And as technology's changed, I think that will change. So if there's some way to strike a balance in my mind for the non-accredited, sounds like everyone's comfortable with the accredited standard. It's that present at the physical location.
Yeah, it would be similar to what's allowed for supervision now.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, that it's face-to-face, doesn't have to be in the physical location.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could change that to asynchronous. But then how would you know if it is in fact asynchronous? No, sorry, synchronous, Synchronous.
Well, when someone does not have a professionally accredited program. We send a questionnaire to the school.
Okay.
And the school fills that out, and so that would be part of the questionnaire.
Okay.
We lost the conference call, so I'm going to call back in real quick.
Okay.
Welcome to the Conference Nation conferencing service. Please enter your PIN number to join your conference. Please hold while we place you into your conference.
Okay, any thoughts then around that? If we were able to look at the physical space piece of that, so that what would be permitted is what we do with supervision now, and that there's still that face-to-face element. You're engaging interactively, but not necessarily in the same physical space. Would that be acceptable? Or
I may be the lone wolf in this area, but there's really not much protecting the quality of non-accredited programs. And so there's really, I think without accreditation protecting the quality of the program, I think most institutions would take what was affordable and what could fit into like a non-clinical setting. So I even struggle with even the synchronous face-to-face Zoom, whatever platform you're thinking of, even allowing that. I think that changes the quality too. So I know I'm kind of a lone wolf in this area, but I really, again, I'm so influenced by how the state really was able to protect some kind of quality. And I appreciated that so much, because even that was hard to hold the line sometimes. And it was like sometimes the only protection of quality, and I'm reticent to.
Sure.
I agree with you, Rebecca, because I'm thinking of, having taught online for the last 18 months, it's been very difficult to get to know the students because it's a group of students. Supervision is different. It's one-on-one or the most two. I've never done group supervision online, and you get to know the individual much better. But then when it's a classroom of 20, 30 students, many are lost, or I lose them because you can't connect with all of them. And so I agree that there is the quality is different for sure. So you probably can't equate it to supervision or even telehealth, because it's individuals involved are different.
Well, there's always the option, if we're not ready to sort of chime in, that we think about it, and we can even send out the addiction counseling language and see if that, sparks any, unless we're ready to say, we don't want to make this change or that kind of thing. So, we can always sort of table it, and I can communicate that back to the board that it's still something we're ambivalent about. But
I think the COAM, accredited programs, sounds like it's unanimous that we're okay with that. No in-residence requirements, it's the non-accredited programs.
Yeah, I hear that too, Joyce.
And it might be good to have the other advisory members.
Yes. But I do appreciate the two of you, because of your perspective in university settings, how important that is, as you're looking at it. So I think that's really good feedback, and I can just put it back on the next advisory committee agenda.
Sounds good, because where I teach, I still do face-to-face, so.
And it does make a difference, doesn't it? It does for me. I compared teaching last year to this year, I loved this year much, much more. Okay, we'll put that back on the next agenda item. So thank you for that conversation. Another issue that has arisen that we discovered was around issues on the approved supervisor designation. There are just some language things we need to clean up. So Leslie, whichever one you want to take on first, if you want to talk about the CEUs first, that's fine. And then I can, I know you and I talked about the supervision of supervision piece. So whichever one you want to start with, and then we'll.
I think it would be easier to start with supervision of supervision because that kind of leads into the CEU.
Okay.
So the supervision of supervision, it says hands-on practice in supervision. It doesn't have any, the definition that's on the application is one that was written by Terry Fahnensteel. And it was also felt that hands-on meant in person. And with the changes in the supervision, I thought that should be addressed because people do ask if they can do televideo, and in the past they haven't been allowed to. And I know that it stopped a couple people from becoming a supervisor at the time because there was no one in their area to provide the supervision. And secondly, what it says that the applicant has to complete 15 hours of continuing education, and supervision of supervision is not continuing education. It's supervision. And in the CEU regulation, you're allowed to get hours if you're providing supervision, but you can't obtain any CEU hours for receiving supervision. So I was trying to change the application, and it was difficult because it says 15 hours of continuing education. And I was trying to make it not appear so bold that it wasn't continuing education.
So I definitely had, I've had the fortune of being able to think about this for a minute. So you're handing this cold to the advisory committee, but
right.
So the first thing that I thought of, the language in our reg is the training shall include 15 hours, either 15 hours of continuing education and supervision or 1 semester credit hour of a graduate level course on supervision, blah, 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 academic, but it includes the following material. And number 1 is the hands-on practice and supervision consisting of 8 hours. So I thought about, 1, if we just say the training shall include 15 hours of education instead of continuing education, unless we're really wanting to allow me obtaining supervision at this level as a CEU. So there's sort of that, what are we willing to allow? Do we want the supervisor candidate to be able to claim CEUs for getting that 8 hours of soup of soup?
Now, I just completed my 30-hour virtual.
Yeah.
So this is a particular interest of mine because I'm getting ready to put in that application to move that. But that continuing education, I mean, it's just like an AMFT approved status. I have 36 hours to get, and then now we have 8 on top of that. So I'm trying to figure out if it would be better, I think, if we could have it as a CEU, that 8 hours.
I think it also depends on how we're looking at supervision. To me, it's an additional education because it's an additional responsibility separate from being a therapist. So you're learning how to be a supervisor, where CEUs for a therapist is you're continuing your education, keeping up for, to continue to improve your ability to be a therapist, efficient therapist. So that's separate to me. So hence in my mind, it's not the CEU when you the education or training to be a supervisor. So that's how I'm seeing it.
But you can have, I mean, even as it stands now, we can count, you can count CEU hours for doing what you do right now here on this advisory committee. I mean, those are allowable continuing education elements because we've defined those things that you can do that are outside of taking a course with a test for continuing ed. So, I hear your point, and I think someone who's taken on going through the paces to become an approved supervisor should be able to count that education as part of continuing education in the field. I don't see those as
I think it's a little different. Yeah, I agree with you, Mary, because it's not like I'm going and learning how to do therapy, right? I'm going in there and they're going to go over and I'm learning something hopefully from a mentor and doing some of these, mentor hours. And I know I'm biased, so I admit that because I'm in that process. But it seems to me if it's one of those, like if I'm reading a book or I'm being a part of the board or something like that, what we count sometimes CUs isn't just a class or a workshop.
Right.
So that's kind of my thought on that.
I'm sorry, I am still trying to track specifically what the question is on the table.
Okay. Yeah, sure, fair enough.
Okay.
It gets like that sometimes. So we have the way the regulation is written says that the person must obtain 15 hours of training. It actually says continuing education in supervision and then lists all the things that need to be done. On the other side of the continuing education regulation, what counts as continuing education for MFTs, we don't include that. Is that an easy way to say it, Leslie?
Yes.
So it's not an activity that we say is an approved continuing education activity. Even though we wrote in the regulation 15 hours of continuing education in supervision, that's what's going to qualify you to get the designation. We don't allow it on the other side of the CEU language. So they don't match.
So they would either have to be allowed or the language would have to be changed. Is that right?
Well, we actually probably need to change the language either way, the way I see it, because this one says it calls it continuing education. And so that if calling it that then would lead one to believe that it's continuing education on the credit side, what can count. So I think either way, we need to make a shift. Either take it out of this regulatory language that says continuing education, and we would just say needs to, get training in these topics, and it would leave it like that.
Mary, I just looked up the statute and it says continuing education. It says it says that has completed the minimum number of continuing education hours related to the enhancement of supervision skills approved by the board. So I think it has to be continuing education.
Thank you. So then we would need to allow it on the other side.
Right.
And I believe, I am biased too, John. been through the program, AAMFT program. I think it was a long program that I certainly was appreciative of wanting to make sure those hours got counted.
Yeah, anything I can make it count. I mean, because I just finished that 30 hours and doing that 36 hours mentor, you know, I'd like to be able to count some of that.
So I might add something that a little piece of that. In the CEU regulation, you are allowed to count supervision that you provide as continuing education. So if you're receiving supervision of supervision, you could still count 8 hours of supervision that you're providing.
That's true. Yeah, that was like a little mind work thing, but yes, you could. I think for me, it's just, I'm sorry, Joyce.
Is that part of our statutes? Is that what we did earlier?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Regulation.
Yeah. I can see, I mean, I can be persuaded. So I can see that, yes, because I think most people will obtain the training to be a supervisor once in their lifetime.
Right.
Not CEUs to, so once in a lifetime. So that 30 hours or however many hours that you need to, the 15 hours actually just for the board, that will be totally fine as a CEU, because it's not like you're going to do it every year. It's once and that's it.
Right. Most of the training counts. The piece that isn't explicitly stated is this 8 hours of the soup of soup. And so that, I think, is what Leslie and I, when we talked, we'd like to get that into the CEU language so that it's clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would be in favor of that too.
Okay.
Because that's a lot of investment of time and money for somebody to get that supervision of supervision.
That's
Rebecca.
Right.
So it would be that the 8 hours of Super Soup could also be considered for CEUs.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, because there's another item in this too.
Oh no, okay.
The receiving of supervision that would be allowed as a continuing education item, new one.
Yeah, I would be in favor of that.
And the clarification, that's not part of the 15 hours, or is that part of the 15 hours?
It is part of the 15 hours.
So
the 15 hours is inclusive of, the way this is written, the 15 hours is inclusive of 8 hours of soup of soup or 8 hours actually of the practice of supervision. So that's actually the other piece I want to talk about. So hold that in your mind for a minute. The regulation says 15 hours inclusive of 8 hours of hands-on practice, and then these their set of topics, best practices, postmodern, ethics, those kind of things. So that would really be the balance of that 15 hours, the 7 hours left in those training requirements. Does that make sense? Because it's written inclusive of.
Mm-hmm.
So a 15-hour total requirement for Kansas.
Mm-hmm. So these are 15 hours, not credit hours, right?
Not credit hours, just 15 hours.
So if you've got 15 hours and 8 hours is soup of soup and 8 hours is a practice of supervision, then where's the education?
No, so that's not how it's written. It's written inclusive of the hands-on practice and supervision consisting of 8 hours. And then it has 8 other items. They have to include best practices, classic and postmodern models, ethical and legal, cultural and contextual, structuring supervision, the positive working relationship, Kansas MFT regs, and then it goes into how they have to submit materials. So you have to still hit those categories of education and 8 hours of hands-on practice and supervision.
So 7 hours of CEUs, 8 hours of supervision to total 15.
Correct. That's my interpretation of how this is written. And I really am not recommending changing that at all.
I would say to be told.
There is something I want to change, but I don't want to change that. Go ahead.
If it's not something that they can get through CEUs, I feel better now because they can get credit for providing supervision. So at least there's that. Mm-hmm. However, you know, if they want to count that somewhere else. But if they can't get it through, continuing education, then it needs to be removed from the regulation. Don't you think, Mary? I mean, if they can't be used, then they can't, then it shouldn't be part of continuing education in the supervisor grade.
And I think that's what everyone sort of came to consensus here on, is what I heard.
Say that again, Mary. Sorry, I didn't get. If what is not included, it needs to be removed.
The 15 hours. If you weren't able to count continuing education credits, yes, because it says continuing education, the training shall consist of continuing education.
Sure. So this continuing education 15 could be part of the 40 hours of continuing education that therapists needs every 2 years, correct?
We want it to be, and not all of it can be at this point.
Yes, yes. And I think we're all in agreement that it could be. I think the question I have is, so if it's the 15 hours, if 8 hours is the provision of supervision or the receiving of supervision, right?
That's my next question, the way it's written.
So if there's only 7 hours left to cover that content, it's not enough. You're talking about, I teach a supervision class, which is a 15-week class, which is a 45-hour class. Things could be done within 30 hours because it's, you know, we do a lot of discussion. So 30 hours to cover a lot. I would say even half of that, 15 hours. So you're doing 7 hours. I'm not sure how much they would get in 7 hours. It's not a lot.
I hear you. And I would also say it is really difficult for people to get this training. I mean, it is a challenge. That's one of the questions Leslie and I are fielding left and right. And there's really very few groups who are providing a training on supervision, and the cost is really high. And so,
well, you know, I just completed that AMFT training, and I'm sitting here looking at the regulations, but they didn't specify any Kansas statutes on regs. So,
and that's what you would want to do as part of your education with your supervisor,
right?
So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Joyce, when I know when we worked on this approved supervisor content, but the reality is we already can't get people to be approved supervisors, and we only have 80 some in the state that are approved supervisors, and people aren't getting the training. I've had people from Western Kansas reach out to me. They can't find training anywhere, and WMFT has stopped just the half of it. You have to do the whole thing now. So I think, again, when I look at workforce and the ability to broaden MFTs, I think we've sort of done a little bit of a disservice. We did it out of good reason, but it is hard. I mean, those are the questions, and I get very regularly from people. There's no one to provide supervision. There's nowhere to get the training.
Yeah, just looking at the form, again, based upon just what I've completed, you know, the 30 hours and all that, most of that's covered, but
yes,
you know, you have to go and then do 8 more hours and then do this and find training on, I mean, you would have a supervisor go over that, but if you're trying to start seeing a supervision, you know, getting 8 hours right away is, you know, supposed to get that. Yeah.
At the same time, I think our role is quality control. We have to ensure that people are trained to be supervisors. And just like we have to go through the training to be therapists, it's a long time. It takes years to get our license. It's an investment. And it means something to be licensed. It needs to mean something to be an approved supervisor. And that's
absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. But it's, you know, I've been doing this 25 years and now having to go back through all this process again, because I did it a long time ago, but that was more than 10 years ago. So I had to go through it again.
Yeah. AMFT's online training, I believe, is like $250. So
yeah, I get that.
I did mine. I did my renewal every 5 years. We have to renew that. I did my training last year. I think it was 250. 15
that 30 hours was $800.
Yeah.
So that's the first time you're doing it's 30, but then you continue. You know, every 5 years it's 15 hours. Half of that, slightly less than half. And that's we're requiring the 15 hours, so they can do the AMFT for 250 for 15 hours. That would need help or wouldn't it?
So, and I would just offer that there's only one other discipline who does board approved supervisors, and the other disciplines have rejected moving towards board approved supervision because of these very issues of people not being able to find training, people not being able to find supervision. So, I mean, if that's something you want to discuss on another agenda item, I think we can put it on the agenda. If there's something else you want to add in quality, there is a problem I was referencing in the way this is said that Leslie and I were kind of batting back and forth, is that it says the practice or hands-on practice and supervision, including 8 hours. Or of at least 8 hours. When I read that, I don't see anything in there that says this is a requirement to have supervision. This is a requirement to provide supervision. So,
so then
it's sort of, even though we are all saying, and it's on the application, your supervision of supervision, that's actually not what this says to me.
Hands-on practice and supervision.
Which means I'm providing supervision to people. But I believe, if I can kind of remember this, the intent was, yes, you needed the hands-on practice of supervision and you needed the supervision from someone else to monitor and manage that. So anyway, there was a little bit of, when Leslie brought this first continuing education and I went back and read it, I was like, wow, we might have a couple of cleanup items. And again, I don't want to make things harder for people, but I don't think that was the intention of what we were saying. And maybe it's not as big of a problem as my mind created it to be, but.
Well, I think that if we look at that as the person providing supervision, then we have taken care of the fact that it needs to be in the CEU regulation because that's already there. You can provide supervision and count CEUs unless it's not enough hours. But I think it is.
Well, so, okay, maybe I should pull up the statute. Does the statute actually say, because I'm only looking at the reg.
The statute doesn't give the list of items. It just says the minimum number of CEUs. So
yeah. But there is actually nothing in the regulation that says you have to get a supervision of supervision.
You're right.
And then we give an application that says have your supervisor provide.
See, when we were going back and forth in emails, I'm like, well, yeah, you're right. The regulation does not say that. So we need to change the application. And then when we change the application, it takes care of both problems. Unless you want to change the reg so it is supervision of supervision.
Yeah, I have a feeling this is going to be a conversation. I think we all assumed that this was what it said. And when that's why I was like, I read that, I was like, that doesn't say anything. No one has to get supervision of supervision. You know, that's something we all thought was there, but in practical language, it's not. So we can sort of weigh in on this. We can defer it to when we have a larger group to think about. We could say, you know, we really want to make this recommendation that we put what the intention was back into here. What are the thoughts with this particular issue?
Yeah.
I'd kind of like to see maybe at our next meeting, like the actual language, how it is now, and then the proposed like changes or edits next to it.
Okay.
I think that would help me kind of
For the application or the regulation?
Maybe both, maybe.
What is it? Is it
MetaVision?
Yeah, I pulled it up and I'm looking at it right now. It's on the BSRB website.
Yeah, so the language says, item number 1, your training shall consist of hands-on practice in supervision of at least 8 hours. It doesn't say hands-on supervised practice of supervision. And so we have all, I think, understood it to be one thing, but it's actually not what it says. However, the application we have, and we, Rebecca, we can pull them and have them at the next meeting so we can really have a more thoughtful conversation with all the information. The application requires that supervisor, essentially, who's your supervisor, and someone saying, yes, I provided these hours of supervision.
I'll get them all together and give them to
Well,
Dave. Gets that all.
So I'm looking at the instructions for becoming an approved supervisor, which is from your website. And it says here, the training requirements found in KAR, etc. This training shall include 15 hours of continuing education, which includes 8 hours of supervision and hours of continuing education and supervision training. Or once.
Yes, but the regulation does not say that.
So
the regulations do not say that. That is an instruction sheet, which actually isn't backed by regulation.
So what actually, I guess we have to ask ourselves, what actually do we want? Do we want
yes.
8 hours of supervision practice or 8 hours of supervision of supervision?
Correct.
And
that's the question. And likely we want both. I don't want to speak for the whole group, but then we need to say that that 8 hours of hands-on practice is supervised practice.
Yeah, because there's no point of having practice if it's not, you're not.
Yes.
I don't want to use the word monitored, but mentored.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will bring this piece to the next advisory meeting, but we are all okay with changing the language around the continuing education, allowing that to be continuing education. Is that what I understand?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Great.
Actually, it's already, isn't it not?
What's that?
It's already that language that's used, isn't it not?
The language is used continuing education, but where we discuss what's allowable for continuing education, it's not there.
Okay.
And that's the piece that Leslie wanted to bring to our attention. So we'll have that language. Do you want to bring proposed language, Leslie, or on that item?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you want. Because if you're not going to make it supervision of supervision, then there's no change needed in the CEU regulation. because the person who is
can already claim it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good point.
I don't mind, but I don't, striking it all out and renumbering and everything is a pain.
Okay, so we will table this till next meeting, because you're right. You're absolutely right. You shouldn't give proposed language if it isn't necessary, but it'll help us guide the next move.
But I'll get the statutes and regs in the application and get it all ready for your next meeting.
Okay, thank you. The last new item was there's been a proposal about synchronizing license expiration dates for those who have multiple licenses. So if you have, for example, an MFT and also an addictions license, and you have different dates on those, there was a proposal that we could sync up those dates so they would have the same cycle essentially and same expiration date. So I wanted to get some information about how the advisory committee feels about that. As someone who has multiple licenses, I kind of like the fact that they don't expire at the same time. Just helps you keep track of the CEUs and the money and all of those things. But what do you think our members would want?
Well, just being able to pay for 2 licensures and all of that at the same time, it's a lot. So I kind of like them when they're split. They're like 3 or 4 months apart. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of think this is one of those things where some people would really like it and others would really not like it, because it's very individual to your circumstance. And I just kind of expected that since I got them at different times, they would not be on the same schedule. Leslie or David, was there anything to add to this conversation on what other people were thinking?
Well, I guess the thing to add to it is that if there is a change, it would need to be a change in statutes. This would be something that would go into a bill. And part of the reason we can't do it right now is because in statute, it specifies the length of time for licensure. And so for all the professions except licensed psychology renews every June of even numbered years, but the rest of them, it talks about a 2-year licensure cycle from the date that you receive your initial license. And so in order to sync up the licenses now, it would essentially mean not following that 2-year licensure cycle that's in the statutory regulations. So I think everybody's kind of in agreement that we wouldn't be able to add more months onto somebody's licensure if this was something that would be preferred. But it would be some language that could potentially let people sacrifice months within that 2 years to have the expiration date sync up. But I think you described those issues really well. Some individuals like the idea of being able to have them in the same month so they don't forget. And so they know that every March of every 2 years, they're going to have to pay for their licenses. But that's the other issue of, do you really want to have both fees at the same time? And do you want to have to worry about having all of the continuing education hours due at the same time too? So those are all different factors into the equation.
Thank you.
And whether or not, if there was a change, it would be for everyone mandatory. I mean, they talked about that, or if it would be up to the person.
Yeah, and that just sort of concerned me for, again, the BSRB of people who opted to sync them up and people who didn't. And well, what if, Leslie, I thought I was going to do them all in June, but I must have clicked the wrong box on this, and now I'm, those kind of things that happen. So.
Right. It hasn't. I don't know that it would cause a lot of extra work for the staff. It would just be the initial license where someone would have to keep track of the expiration date because it automatically goes 2 years out. But other than that, I think it should be okay.
Yeah, and just to give you an idea too, there's about 14,200 licenses under the BSRB currently in terms of permanent licenses. And so there's about 1,100 people who have more than one license. And I think the most licenses someone has is up to 3. So I don't think anybody has more than 3 licenses, but there are some within that 1,100 people that have 2 or potentially 3 licenses in different areas.
Are there any preferences from this group?
Mary, kind of based on what you and John are saying. And then, yeah, it doesn't maybe seem worth it to go through all of that for something that would maybe potentially be helpful to some people, but not helpful to other people.
Okay.
I wonder whether it's probably more work for the BSRB staff if you could give an option for people if they want to synchronize their expiration date of the license or not.
Yes, I think they said that's something potentially they could do. Either if we did that, though, you'd still have to make the statutory language change.
Mm-hmm.
So is this more of a either way we're okay, or do we have a no, this isn't something we're in support of? Yes, we are in support of.
I guess okay. I would like to make it as affordable as possible. And so if it sounds it's probably more affordable if different dates of expiration than having to put it all together. Yeah, so that's what I would lean towards.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll see sort of what the sense of the larger board, and if there's real emphasis in trying to bring this forward as a statutory issue, and then if we're in support of that, then I think what I'm hearing is people like the flexibility of options then. Not something we would want to take up on our own is what I'm hearing. Didn't seem like high enough value. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Are there any other business items for today? Well, then we get to figure out our next meeting.
All right.
We'll be into the holidays.
Crazy.
I know. Time is going so quickly. So I believe if we stay on our current path, it would be December 10th. Should be Friday. David, do you know if there's any conflicts on that date?
Nope, I don't see any conflicts on the calendar.
Are there any conflicts among this group?
Not for me.
Not for me.
Okay, well, we will plan it for December 10th at 10. And we'll have some good agenda items to discuss again too. And if there's ever anything that you all want to bring up, please let me know, send it to me, and I'll make sure to get it on the agenda. David, Leslie, anything else from your end?
Not that I can think of.
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay, anyone want to make a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn, Joyce.
I would say that.
Okay. Rebecca, are you in favor?
Yes.
Thank you all so much for such a good meeting. I appreciate your input and hope you all have a great weekend.
Take care all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.